Hello, everyone. Let us talk about the most punishing diagnosis that we give to trauma survivors and the way in which it has been used, especially to label women survivors of trauma as personality disordered rather than as victimized and traumatized. We keep forgetting that this link between borderline personality disorder and trauma goes back to the 80s. Otto Kernberg, the most, I would say, the most punishing theorist on borderline personality disorder, wrote, "The most important cause of severe personality disorders is severe chronic traumatic experiences, such as physical or sexual abuse, severe deprivation of love, severe neglect, and unavailable parental objects." So we knew as far back as the 80s. And then over and over again, in 1989, in 1993, in 2001, research has made that connection repeatedly. Very high percentages, 81% of the first sample of borderline personality disorder subjects reported histories of childhood trauma. The study by Sansone and colleagues found that 70% of primary care patients reported childhood trauma, and 70% of them qualified for a diagnosis of BPD. So over and over again, the 2001 study showed that the hippocampal volume in subjects with BPD was smaller than normal controls, just as we find in traumatized populations. We know from research that women experience twice the rate of major depression, twice the rate of generalized anxiety disorders, panic disorders compared to men. They have substantially higher rates of PTSD, which makes sense when you think that there are substantially higher rates of abuse of female children. In terms of mental disorders, men outnumber women only when it comes to impulse control disorders. Now, the gender differences that are found in every diagnostic category, except again, impulse control and substance abuse, are even more dramatic when it comes to the borderline diagnosis, which is given 3 times more often to women than to men. And whether that's the result of the disparity in rates of abuse, whether it's the result of gender-related implicit bias, nonetheless, it means that the treatment women are going to receive if they get that diagnosis will be less supportive, less validating, and certainly is unlikely to go along with a validation of the trauma that these women have been through. Interesting. A study by Wellman found that when they looked at children being approached by potential perpetrators, that girls were more likely to be abused. So boys and girls get approached by potential perpetrators. Boys, according to Wellman, more often were able to leave this situation, but girls were twice as likely to be abused. He theorized, perhaps because they were more compliant and more responsive to the needs of others. The other thing that was very interesting was that boys were more likely to be physically abused, girls more likely to be sexually abused. And he divides these gender differences by talking about the connection between men having externalizing disorders and women having a tendency toward internalization disorders, like depression, like anxiety. So what if we take borderline personality? I wish I could change the name, but let's take it out of the category of personality disorder and see what happens if we think about borderline personality disorder as a traumatic attachment disorder to which women are going to be more vulnerable because of the rates of abuse of women. Giovanni Liotti, probably the most inspiring speaker on this topic, wrote, "Frightened and frightening caregiving behavior causes fright without solution, because the caregiver becomes at the same time the source and the solution of the infant's alarm." He says, fear comes to paradoxically coexist with the soothing provided by proximity to the caregiver. And when I first read that sentence, I got chills up and down my spine. Imagine, fear comes to coexist with soothing. And then, of course, that becomes part of the legacy that these children carry into adulthood, so that just at the moment that there is a comforting, warm moment of closeness, it's going to evoke fear. In the attachment research of the last 35 years, disorganized attachment, that's the term given to it by the researchers, has been consistently correlated with parental behavior, usually maternal behavior, characterized as frightening or appearing frightened. And very interestingly, the children in these studies have almost the exact same symptoms that we see in abused children, like a higher resting heart rate, like changes in cortisol production. And they exhibit, this is why the researchers called it disorganized, this very striking approach avoidance behavior, meaning these little children, 1 year old, remember, that's when most of the attachment research begins, at age 1. 1 year olds who at first look like securely attached children because they're excited to see their mothers and they have a big smile as they walk toward her. And then you see them freeze as they get closer and closer to the mother, and their eyes get big and they start to walk away, basically walk backwards. That is attachment plus fear. Interestingly enough, disorganized attachment status at age 1 is the only statistical predictor of borderline personality disorder. Meaning, you could take a group of 1 year olds with disorganized attachment and predict that a significant number of them would eventually be given a borderline diagnosis. It's a chilling thought. Now, disorganized attachment has two different, I call them flavors, but the essential characteristic is the internal struggle between the attachment drive and the drives to flee or fight. Thus, the little 1-year-old who toddles toward the mother and then freezes and backs away. But we still have two different variations on this theme. One group is called disorganized attachment with preoccupied tendencies, a group of mostly females. These are individuals who pursue closeness, who experience an intense yearning for closeness, separation anxiety, fear of abandonment. But as the closeness grows, suddenly begin to experience mistrust, the sensitivity to empathic failure becomes heightened, and they are quick to anger and to pushing their partners away. The other group, not surprisingly, mostly male, have disorganized attachment with avoidant or dismissing tendencies. Often they come to therapy longing for a relationship, but as much as they might long for closeness, they can't actually pursue closeness. They keep their distance and make sure that others keep their distance as well. So here's the first group, and this is very, very interesting to see these cartoons. Honey, I got you some flowers to complain about. Right? Notice the cartoonist assumes that the complaining partner is female. And here it's the second, disorganized attachment with dismissing tendencies. A man saying, my preference is for someone who's afraid of closeness like me. So, so often implicit bias shows up in our expressions, in our cartoons. It might not have been the conscious thought of the cartoonist to assume that the woman is the complainer and the man is afraid of closeness. And here is something else that keeps being forgotten. As in all trauma-related disorders, borderline personality disorder, affect dysregulation is the leading symptom of psychopathology. Rapidly rising intense negative affects occur even in response to low-level stimuli, which, as therapists, we would say, even in response to very small triggers. So let's talk about the autonomic dysregulation that is one of the hallmarks of post-traumatic stress. As you all know, we have a nervous system capable of very high arousal, enough to give us the energy to run for miles, or to be that little old lady who fights off her attacker with her stick. We also have a nervous system capable of very, very low arousal, as in hypothermia or a medically induced coma in which the energy level, the autonomic energy level, is lowered so that all the body's energy can go into enduring. Those are the two settings for threat and danger. Is it safer to flee or fight? Is it safer to lay low? And the nervous system instinctively responds to danger with the most adaptive strategy. So the effect of trauma is to create autonomic habits of either high arousal symptoms or low arousal symptoms. So here we have some of the hyperarousal relational symptoms. A sensitivity to dysregulation, to respond as if to threat with increasing closeness. Chronic hypervigilance and mistrust. Often that's how we know the client is hypervigilant, because the mistrust gets verbalized. Separation anxiety, preoccupation with relationships and safety within them. Intense, overwhelming affects, right? Because if you take that sympathetic arousal, it inflates or escalates any emotion to what one of my clients once called a tsunami level. She said, we don't have feelings, we have tsunamis. Rejection sensitivity, emotional storms, impulsive self-destructive behavior, suicidality, suicide threats, as well as actions. And this description, which is really a description of autonomic symptoms of trauma, fits perfectly with the diagnosis of borderline personality. You can see how easy it would be to give someone a diagnosis of borderline based on those symptoms. And then we see clients who usually come in describing themselves as depressed. And they are in a parasympathetic state of low energy, numbness, disconnection from affect. Often they are so shut down that we feel like we're talking to a wall. The feelings, the feelings that go with sympathetic arousal are anger, anxiety, and intense acute grief. The emotions that go with parasympathetic arousal are shame and hopelessness, depression. Often these are clients who go through the motions, often very slowed. They often are very avoidant and yet yearn for closeness. And often their cognitive processing is so slowed that even a conversation with the therapist is difficult. So this is what trauma does. And so we have a choice when we meet this client, especially the client who alternates between these two states. We can say, this is a client with complex post-traumatic stress, or we can say, this is a client with borderline personality disorder, and immediately stigmatize the client. Now, let's add another complication, what we call triggering. But triggering is actually a brain and body problem. The human brain is, born with us, is a brain that with a negativity bias. So even before anything happens, the human brain, researchers have found as early as 6 months, is biased toward processing negative information before positive information. The brain is biased to pick up negative or threatening cues before perceiving positive cues. And so you can imagine if we have an innate negativity bias, and then the child is traumatized, the brain and body are going to become even more biased, even more exquisitely sensitive to cues even remotely connected to the trauma. For example, disappointment is often a trigger. Right? Think how often abused and neglected children experience disappointment. So we're used to some of the more obvious triggers, people who resemble the perpetrator, times of the year, anniversary reactions, but we forget that very subtle things can also trigger a threat response. And what gets triggered are the implicit or feeling memories of the trauma. Implicit memories of panic over separation, implicit memories of yearning to tell someone and being unable. So those implicit memories are experienced as something that is happening right here, right now. And what most of us do when we have a distressing feeling is we try to explain it. We say, it's because my friend was late to meet me. It's because my husband is self-involved and insensitive. We don't say, I wonder if this distressing feeling is a memory. Martin Teicher, who has studied the brains of traumatized children and adolescents for many, many years, for 20, 30 years, writes, if an individual is born into a malevolent and stress-filled world, I'm going to change the pronouns, by the way, to her, it is crucial for her survival to maintain a state of vigilance and suspiciousness that enables her to readily detect danger. She will need the potential to mobilize an intense fight-flight response and to react aggressively to challenge in order to facilitate trauma. These survival defense responses markedly augment the individual's capacity to rapidly and dramatically shift into an intense aggressive state when threatened by danger or loss. He's talking about traumatized children. And he could be describing our female client with the borderline diagnosis, who, just as he says, maintains, or whose body maintains, a state of vigilance and suspiciousness, scanning the environment for signs of danger. And therefore, that brain and body is ready to rapidly and dramatically shift into an intense aggressive state when threatened by danger or loss. Meaning, for children, loss is danger, right? So there is the danger of attack. But if you're a child or an adult who has been traumatized as a child, loss puts that individual in even more danger. But our client may have little to no memory of the trauma. We know from the research on traumatic memory, the brain scan research on traumatic memory, that trauma is remembered more frequently in the form of feeling and body memories. But in addition, we all know that our women clients often have been traumatized since they were very young, since infancy, toddlerhood, and during the years when their brains are relatively undeveloped or in the process of development, and we don't yet have the structures in the left brain that are needed to remember events in words, right? If you've been around children, you know that it takes a long time in development before children can actually give you a coherent narrative of what happened. Now, how was school? Not so good. What happened? I don't know, right? So we remember the feeling of what happens for many, many years before we are able to put experience into words. In fact, amnesia for the trauma before the age of 9 is not considered significant, because being the ability to remember in sequence a coherent chronological narrative simply does not, that ability does not develop in the brain until ages 10, 11, 12. So memory for early childhood experience exists without words. We remember with our feelings, with our bodies. The autonomic nervous system remembers its habits of alarm, hyperarousal, or alarm, lay low. It remembers the experience of being seen but not heard, the experience of shame, the experience of disgust, of being overwhelmed. And we remember with our tendencies to approach, to stiffen. If you think about hugging people, right? When you hug someone, some of that hug is memory. You learn to hug or not hug, or to hug stiffly, or to hug in a big, warm bear hug. We learn in childhood because we learn, or our bodies learn and remember, what is the most adaptive way of being close and also being safe. So here are the symptoms, the diagnostic criteria for borderline personality disorder. Frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. I would say it would be more appropriate to say frantic efforts to avoid real or perceived abandonment. because trauma survivors don't imagine abandonment. They experience or perceive it. Secondly, a pattern of unstable, intense relationships characterized by alterations between idealization and devaluation. So just think, when driven by the intense yearning for closeness, most human beings idealize that person to whom they want to be close. And then when that idealized person empathically fails, disappoints, or betrays, there is fight and flight. Devaluation goes with fighting and fleeing. We don't say, what a wonderful person. I'd like to punch his nose, right? We say, get away, you terrible person, or come closer, you wonderful person. Identity disturbance, unstable sense of self. Interestingly enough, also a characteristic found in adults with disorganized attachment. How is it possible to have a stable sense of self in the context of abuse? How is it possible to have a stable sense of self in the context of traumatic attachment? Because one moment there is this intense yearning and even pursuing of an idealized person. And then there's the disappointment, the sense of abandonment, the sense of unsafety, and fight and flight. So often, our clients don't know, am I the victim or am I an angry you-know-what? Impulsivity in 2 or more self-damaging areas. So all we have to do is go back to this diagram, and you can see why impulsive behavior is part of the picture. Remember, sympathetic hyperarousal is the nervous system's way of driving us to action, just as parasympathetic arousal is the body's way of getting us to inhibit action. And for those of you who think in polyvagal terms, parasympathetic hypoarousal is a dorsal vagal response. Sympathetic arousal, of course, is active defensive responses. The social engagement system is only available when our nervous systems are in the window of tolerance, meaning we are in a state in which we can tolerate our intense emotions or the numbness and flatness or depression or shame. So moving forward again, sorry about that. So impulsivity goes with this picture. Recurrent suicidal behavior, threats, self-harm. Makes sense because suicidality and self-harming behavior both regulate the nervous system. Suicidal clients will say, when I imagine that I can die, I feel relief. When I know I have a way out, I feel relief. Self-harm capitalizes on body chemistry. Self-harm triggers any type of injury to the body, triggers first an adrenaline response so that we feel calm, cool, collected, and energized, powerful, followed by another chemical, neurochemical, the endorphins. And as you know, the endorphins are the body's happy chemicals. We relax, the body relaxes, we get an analgesic effect, and we feel in really quite palpable relief. So it makes sense that recurrent suicidal behavior and self-harm go with the diagnosis of any trauma-related disorder. Affective instability due to reactivity of mood. I would say affective instability due to post-traumatic triggering. Again, imagine our diagram, right? Affective instability, ups and downs between high arousal, impulsivity, anger, and fear, and that parasympathetic state of giving up, giving in, and shutting down. Chronic feelings of emptiness, right? You know, even when we say the word empty, you know, if I say, I feel empty, I feel a kind of hollowness inside. If you talk to people about that feeling of hollowness or emptiness in the body, often they will say it goes with the feeling of being unloved. Because in childhood attachment, it is that closeness that in early infancy gives the baby a sense of warmth, closeness, safety, and that fills that baby's body with positive feelings. Inappropriate, intense anger or difficulty controlling anger is a fight response. And of course, we know that all of the survival defenses, fight, flight, freeze like a deer in the headlights, submit, or cry for help, we know that all of them are activated by post-traumatic triggers. But if borderline personality disorder represents an attachment disorder, remember the crux of disorganized attachment are these huge swings from the intense yearning and idealization to the disappointment, the triggering, and anger or flight. And then transient paranoid ideation, including voices or severe dissociative symptoms. It's very rare for me to thank the DSM or ICD because I'm someone who thinks about trauma rather than diagnosis. But I am so glad that the diagnosis mentions voices, because we have made a terrible mistake in our field by assuming that hearing voices is always a symptom of psychosis. Once again, we have research that contradicts that. We have research showing that individuals with borderline personality diagnoses hear voices at a higher rate than the average person. We have research reporting voices in combat veterans. Voices are equally a symptom of trauma. And dissociation is equally a symptom of trauma. So the symptoms, of course, unique to each client, can tell us that client's story. Again, often more accurately than the story reported by the client. We put a lot of stake in the story that the client tells. The tradition in the field is usually to take a history at the first visit, and then to assume that that's the complete history. Trauma research says that that's unlikely, because when we have trauma responses, the prefrontal cortex is inhibited and the language centers shut down, so that, and the verbal expression areas of the left brain shut down, so that we don't have access to words and narrative memory. So think about your clients who carry this diagnosis, and think about the symptoms that tell their story. I'm thinking of a young woman, a 25-year-old young woman, who came to consult with me because she said, I'm just not able to have relationships. And she said, and I know my psychiatrist sent me to you because you're an expert on trauma, but I don't have any trauma. She said, all that's happened to me is that I spent the first 9 months of my life in an orphanage before I was adopted by my parents. And she said, but that couldn't be trauma because I don't remember it. And of course, at 9 months, of course she wouldn't remember it. But her symptoms told a story. And here were her symptoms. She said, I really want someone to love me. And when I'm trying to get a man interested in me, I feel frantic. I've got to get him to love me. And she said, because of my looks, and she was a very attractive young woman, she said, it's not easy to attract the attention of men. But then I have to get them to love me. And as soon as they love me, I can't find a single good thing about them. As soon as they love me, I'm disgusted by them. I want them to leave me alone. Everything they do irritates me. And eventually I push them away. She said, with my anger, I'm just relentless until they finally go away. And then I'm heartbroken. That's the story, not of somebody with borderline personality disorder. That's a trauma story. The frantic efforts of a child to get connection. Think of the orphanage experience, right? Children are not safe. They are severely neglected. And just at an age where the attachment drive is particularly intense. And so in an orphanage, imagine being alone is very, very dangerous. When this young lady was alone, she had that intense, frantic need to connect. Then she is in the relationship, and all of her radar, think of hypervigilance as a radar system. The radar system is full on because now she's very close. In an orphanage, it isn't safe to be close to someone because in an orphanage, that kind of closeness is likely to mean some type of abuse or exploitation. Because, you know, in an orphanage, these staff members have too many children to give each one individual attention. So all of her hypervigilance would be heightened. Every small thing that this person would do would elicit that pushing away fight response, resulting in the pattern of intense, unstable relationships. Alternating idealization and devaluation was part of it. And what's not in the diagnosis, but which we encounter over and over, is the pushing away is followed by despair, heartbreak, and again, a frantic need to reconnect. Impulsivity. This young woman not only was impulsive when her fight response was stimulated, she was often impulsive in trying to manage the distress when that instinctive pushing away was successful. Recurrent suicidal threats occur usually in response to the fear of abandonment, the perceived sense of being abandoned, the futility of the fight-flight impulses. The 25-year-old woman would become suicidal after her boyfriend left, when the panic over aloneness was at its height, and followed by despair. It's hopeless. No one will love me. There is no hope. I might as well be dead. Why individuals with borderline personality are called attention-seeking and manipulative is really, it never ceases to appall me. Because yes, on the surface, perhaps you could say, oh, the recurrent suicidal threats are to get the boyfriend's attention. Or we can say, which is more consistent with trauma, suicidal impulses are just the mirror opposite of homicidal impulses. When the fight response is stimulated, our fight response can either be directed toward others, as in homicidality, or directed toward our own bodies. But it's the same impulse. It's the impulse to violence, to achieve control over the other person, over our feelings. And of course it goes with trauma. How could it not? Again, the inappropriate anger and reactivity. If you think about the orphanage, and I've had a couple of clients who spent the early months or years of their lives in orphanages. Often, I remember one who said, she said, you know, my anger saved me in the orphanage because I was that child who would kick and bite and scratch male staff members who would get too close to me. And so that inappropriate anger which became an issue for her later, was actually life-saving in the orphanage. In an orphanage, predators have a choice of many, many, many children. And so the child who kicks and bites and scratches and screams is really not a very convenient child to abuse. Again, what is the anger triggered by tells you a lot of your client's story. Is the anger triggered by lack of attunement? Is it triggered by empathic failure, by emotional distancing, or is it triggered by betrayal, meaning such things as affairs or domestic violence? I'm thinking of a client of mine who often struggles with inappropriate anger and suicidality in the context of being ignored, of being emotionally distanced. Remember that the voices and severe dissociative symptoms, again, research has established both are associated with trauma. And Bruce Perry did some research back in the 90s showing that dissociative symptoms were more common in girl children. So what are the implications for how we help the women who seek treatment with us? First of all, we should start with the assumption that all of our clients who have histories of childhood trauma will show signs of disorganized attachment. The fear of closeness, the fear of abandonment or separation may alternate. The client may have one or the other or both. We have to stop the stigmatizing of the diagnosis. If we can't change the name of the diagnosis, can we, as clinicians, can we fight, can we dispute the chronic stigmatizing of the diagnosis? Can we call it out as a trauma-related disorder rather than calling it a personality disorder? And we have to remember that it is really abandonment and betrayal on top of abandonment and betrayal that women receive this worst of all diagnoses. We can end the pattern that has been established since Otto Kernberg, that women are exhibiting borderline behavior when they're anxiously seeking our help, when they overreact to our empathic failures or our misattunements. Because if we don't understand disorganized attachment, we're not going to understand, we're not going to be attuned. And remember, very importantly, when borderline personality disorder is understood as a trauma-related disorder, it becomes significantly easier to treat. We can help the client understand that she's triggered and she's not crazy. She is triggered, and when she's triggered, the separation panic is evoked, or the mistrust and anger. Remember the words of Viktor Frankl: an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal, right? Trauma is an abnormal situation. Do our quote unquote borderline clients have abnormal reactions? Yes. Do those reactions make sense given that they have lived their formative years in an abnormal situation? Absolutely. Try to see that wounded little girl inside the client's body. That's really, that's what we're treating when we treat women who carry the diagnosis of borderline. Don't notice I don't say women with borderline personality disorder. I say women who carry that diagnosis. Here are some words from my client, Annie. She writes, each little girl who learned to survive the pain is still too scared to open her eyes. She doesn't know she lives in a different world now. I have to help her and the others release their fingers or hands from their eyes and peek out at this other world, my world, where they're safe. Just notice, I want to tell them, until you get used to safety, until safety is expected, taken for granted, until fear is harder and harder to remember. So thank you all for really inviting me to share these ideas with you. And thank you, Tracy. So do we have some questions that?
Yeah, I mean, we've got quite a lot of questions.
Okay.
Some have had more votes than others. So, Janine, there's a really great question. You know, you mentioned sort of the maternal behavior sort of as being a predictor of borderline. And somebody's asked a really good question about sort of the paternal behavior, even if the mother is, you know, securely attached to the baby. So the father being, you know, either frightened or frightening. Just your views on that, please.
Well, you know, it is a very good question. And I just wish that someone was studying paternal attachment behavior. I have two sons with children. I watch their attachment behavior, and I can see its importance to their girl children. They all have girls. But, you know, so often when we take a history, you know, one of the things you can listen for in taking a history is how the two parents are described. So very often, I'd say the majority of cases, I hear this is the most common version. My father was very frightening, and my mother never said a word, never said a peep. Or vice versa. My mother was very frightening, and my father just withdrew. My father didn't want to anger her. And so that combination tends to go hand in hand. Where it doesn't, you know, the thing that's so hard is you can't unscare someone. So imagine we have a little girl who is scared by the frightening parent. And she may have another parent who is safe and more securely attached. But how can that child feel securely attached in a context in which she's being frightened every day? Right? That's the dilemma. Yeah.
Another question you mentioned around, someone has said they loved your sort of destigmatizing word for BPD, such as trauma attachment disorder. It's a little bit of a big question, but what are some of the steps that can be done in the profession to try to help, you know, perhaps change the name? Obviously, it's a big question.
It is a big question. And I know how hard, for instance, Bessel van der Kolk has worked to change the trauma diagnoses in the DSM system. And it has been unsuccessful because the powers that be that create these diagnostic categories seem to not to be uninterested in a new conceptualization of trauma-related disorders. And I suppose we could say the paranoid, but perhaps not inaccurate hypothesis that's out there is that these committees that create diagnostic codes have ties to the pharmaceutical industry. And the pharmaceutical industry is very uninterested in trauma-related diagnoses because they are a mix of diagnostic symptoms rather than something simple like depression is easy to create a medication for. Anxiety is easy to create a medication for. So that's the cynical view. I'll leave it up to our viewers. It'd also be interesting to look at the gender composition of those committees who create our diagnostic systems.
Janina, you just said something that I was thinking, and then and then you verbalized it because so thank you for somehow the interpersonal neurobiology across the screen made the question come out.
Well, I think this is a summit on women, trauma, and mental health. If we can't say it here, where can we say it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Another question, is there a difference between anxious attachment style and traumatic attachment? If you just sort of want to speak to that first, because there's a number of questions in the question.
Yes, absolutely. The insecure attachments, quote unquote, insecure ambivalent or insecure preoccupied versus insecure avoidant, do not show that intense approach avoidance pattern. In anxious ambivalent or insecure ambivalent or insecure preoccupied attachment, you get the attachment seeking intense yearning symptoms, but you don't get the pushing away. In avoidant dismissing attachment, you get the distancing, but there is no yearning. So only disorganized attachment has that push-pull.
And related to that, this person asks, also, what about the young girl who is sexually promiscuous? She's pursuing that sort of good feeling of sexual intercourse, although she has no memory of the abuse. Do you want to talk to that as it relates to what we've just spoken about?
Yes, because again, remember that trauma, especially for children, is remembered more implicitly than explicitly. So let's say this young girl, usually it would be a teenage girl or a young adult, has no verbal memory of the trauma, but has the implicit memories and learned behavior. Many children learn to seek out this sexual abuse so that it doesn't take them by surprise. It's not a conscious behavior. It's an instinctive behavior to provoke it, because the safest time in a child's life is right after the abuse, right? That's the safe time, because that episode is over and the perpetrator is going to be calm and quiet, or even positive for a period of time. So often women describe this. They say, I seek out these relationships, I seek out one-night stands because then I have control.
Mm. Mm.
I remember a young woman I saw many years ago who said, I'd rather have sex with a stranger on a train than I would with somebody I was close to.
Wow.
Wow is right.
Wow.
Yeah.
Can you speak to more about how suicidal ideation play a part in someone with BPD? And I'll just also want to bring in something that you mentioned about sort of, that externalizing behavior of kind of homicidal behavior and that internalizing behavior of, either suicidal ideation or in the unfortunate eventuality of suicide. Do you want to just talk a little bit more around that, Janina? Because that's an interesting sort of paradox that we actually don't highlight in our profession. You see, well, not always, I don't want to make a huge generalization, but you see that sort of external acting out in male gender to more an extent in terms of that fight impulse, but some of those internalized impulse are sort of more female in terms of the acting internal impulse.
Which fits with the research that says women survivors of trauma are more likely to have internalizing disorders and males are more likely to have externalizing disorders. But what I hear from women, because I ask my clients, I say, how young were you the first time you thought about dying as a way to get relief? Or the first time, how old were you the first time you thought about killing yourself? And it's astounding. Women say, I was 6, I was 8, I was 10. I remember the woman who said, oh yes, it was 8, because I remember I threw myself down the stairs in the hopes that it could all be over.
Wow.
Right? Because when you think about it, here's this little child, powerless in a violent, threatening world. There's no exit other than to wish you were dead.
Yeah.
So it starts out as a resource. I can remember the client who said, every day I would promise myself, if I got through today, I could die tomorrow. And then the next day, okay, if I just get through today, I can die tomorrow. The prize was dying tomorrow, because that was the only way this little girl could imagine being free. And so I'm always shocked when I meet trauma survivors who have never thought about killing themselves, because that's the rare group.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Be interesting to look at that difference, what the difference, because I imagine that's not a big group at all. But that sort of internalized resilience would be an interesting sort of research piece.
Absolutely. The other statistic is that women are much more likely to verbalize suicidal feelings. Men are much more likely to actually kill themselves.
And what do you think that's about, Janina, that kind of impulse control between sort of male and female? Do you think sort of that's an innate drive perhaps to do with sort of hormones, or in terms of sort of more testosterone and or is it something else?
I mean, certainly the testosterone is going to make a difference. The aggression, the capacity for aggression and the physical strength allows men to actually, you have to commit an act of violence to die.
Sure.
Right. So it takes a lot of physical strength. So it's very, very interesting. But I think the fact that women do verbalize their wishes to die is a strength, right? And I think it would be helpful to see it that way, to see it as an ingenious attempt to find some way to get control over something that is overwhelming even 20, 30 years later.
And do you think that element of where women perhaps are now is a socialized element of where we are in society? Because, for example, it's been quite hard for men to talk about feelings. Things are getting better, but they're not great because there's sort of high occurrences of men not speaking, suicide, etc. Do you think that's sort of a socialized concept, and it might get better, but that both men and women will start to verbalize their mental health issues as an external regulation in some ways?
Well, I certainly hope so. It could be that because women seem to just genetically be more relationally driven and focused, that's why the communication of feelings and distress, including suicidality, occur. But socialization is going to help everybody.
Yeah, thank you. We'll take one more question. What helps to address the conflict between the need for proximity/distance when we work with service users who have adapted and become sensitized to rejection/potential threat as a result of traumatic attachments?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is normalizing that trauma is the reason why there are these intense feelings of need for connection and the equally intense feelings of I don't trust you, get away from me, you're not safe. And to frame it in terms of triggering rather than in terms of behavior. We've become, and I understand the practical reasons, we've become so behavior oriented. In the US, mental health is now called behavioral health. Right? So it doesn't matter how you feel as long as you're behaving well. Right? So I think if we can shift, at least when we're working with the client, to a way of helping the client understand, oh my gosh, you were so triggered. And then what? And so helping the client to be able to anticipate and to see both sides as a different part of themselves. So,
Janina, go ahead.
So it's really that idea of seeing the little girl inside each client.